Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. If you are new, my name is Watercolour and I'm a botanical watercolor artist and tutor. So this week we're going to be painting mushroom. Full step-by-step tutorial is on my Patreon if you would like to follow along in a real time. But right now I'm going to walk you through the process it took me to paint it. So we're going to start with the top part, the red part. And though you can see it has lots of little white, shall I call dots or speckles, let's say. So very good medium to have with watercolors. If you paint with watercolors quite often, especially botanical, is masking fluid. So what it is, it's a latex based medium that blocks the area they cover with it and won't let the water and watercolors go through it. So basically will protect the white of the paper. And so if you want to keep little bits and pieces white as I do now, then you can continue painting with all your base layers and you're gonna protect all those little bits and pieces and keep the white of the paper, and you can just carry on and paint all your underneath layers with all those beautiful blends and colors. So once I did that, I let it dry and we can go and mix up the colors. So what we're gonna need first is this very bright yellow color. I used Mime Yellow, and I'm gonna use a little bit of neutral color. So for that I'm gonna use neutral tint, but I will warm it up a little bit with some quinacridone gold. Just around the rim, around the edge of the cap, you can see there's a little bit of gray. I also can see a little bit of pink at the very top of the cap, so I'm gonna use permanent rose with a bit of quinacridone magenta. So our main color, the bright red, you can see is gonna be Cenelia red. But to make it a little bit fresher and brighter, I'll add a little bit of that yellow that we used earlier. So for slightly more shadowy red parts, I'm gonna use again Cenelia red, but this time I'm gonna add a little bit of Fallow blue and make it darker. So if you have seen other videos that I've made, you will know that all my foundation layers mostly are done with wet on wet technique. What it means, I apply water on the paper first and then colors on top of it, and that way I can mix different colors, make them settle smoothly and nicely and cover bigger areas, and you can do the lifting for the highlights. So basically you can achieve quite a bit with that technique. So on that wet glaze I started applying a few colors, not all of them. So my pink, my yellow, and a little bit of my neutral tint color. So you can see I'm applying yellow on most of the cap because that's what I can see. It sort of shines through that red. Only at the very top where the red is quite dark, I'm leaving it out. I'm still working while that water glaze is damp on my paper. So basically you have to work fairly quickly. If you want to apply multiple colors, you need to make sure you do that before the glaze dries. So once that is done, I let it dry completely and apply a second glaze of wet on wet. Again, water first, but this time we're going to apply our beautiful bright red color. And I'll start from the very top where the red color is most saturated and darkest, and will walk my way through to the bottom where it's lighter. As I go down, the color red is not as saturated and it also has a little bit of texture, so that's why I start usually from the darkest part, and then as I have a little bit less pigment I start moving into lighter parts, leaving little gaps here and there of yellow because that's what I can see in my reference. And of course, let's not forget our dark red. So we start working a little bit on those values. We want some shadow and light. And I can see a little bit of that dark red at the very top and on the sides. Right, so I let those layers dry completely. And when I say completely, I do mean it. It has to be completely dry. So we still have our masking fluid on the paper, that's why it looks a little bit blotchy. But now I'm going to take my smaller brush and I'm going to use dry pigment. So I let it dry on my palette and I only pick up a little bit of water just to be able to pick up the color and glide smoothly over the paper, but we don't paint as wet as we did with wet on wet technique. So you gotta keep your pigments fairly dry. And I tested it out on a piece of paper and you saw the marks I was making. So what I'm doing now, I'm gonna dry brush entire cap to create that red, really juicy and bright red, and create the surface more velvety without any gaps, watermarks, just to make it look a little bit more solid and deep. So take your time with it. Usually when I dry brush, I don't rush. I don't intend to make visible lines unless that's what we're after. But with very little brush strokes and patiently dry brushing the entire surface, it just creates very even and smooth surface or texture. If you want to have texture, you can do with dry brush, but if you wanted to make it look very smooth, that's how you do it with a dry brush. It makes it look like you drew with pencils, where you also use various different techniques of smoothing and blending the colors when you draw with pencils. But the surface that you get after doing that is very just nice to look at, and that's what I try to achieve with the dry brush. So once we've done that, we can now finally remove our masking fluid, and you can do that either with your clean fingers or a little bit of eraser, as I did with both. And there are actual proper tools to do that, like a little rubber stick, but I don't have it, so I'm still using my fingers and an eraser. So once we removed masking fluid, you can see that those spots or white areas look quite flat, so we want to give them color and dimension and make them look realistic. So I applied a little bit of my neutral gray color very lightly, making sure that there is a little bit of tonal value, so around the edges were slightly darker. And now we want to adjust those little white bits shape, because when you apply masking fluid, it makes it look a bit too big and rounded, while we need to make them a little bit more edgy and sharp and smaller, and some of them merge. So now I pick up my red color, or the color that I have to work on in that particular area, and I try to adjust the shape of each little spot. So the cap part is finished. Now we can clean up the palette, and we're gonna prepare some colors for our underneath the cap and the stem part. So we're gonna mainly need some neutrals. So as my base color for my neutral colors, I'm gonna be using neutral tint. I love that color, and I need a couple of shades, one more warmer, to which I add some yellow, and cooler, to which I add some phthalo blue. So I'm gonna start with this more complicated part. For that, I'm gonna need slightly darker neutral gray color. So again, the same colors, just a bit more saturated. Pick up my really small, the sharpest tip having brush, and I'm gonna start painting or almost drawing in those really little folds and crevices that underneath the cap has. So I'm gonna work on each crevice and shadow at a time. I'm having another brush in my other hand, which is clean, and I use it to soften little edges so that, you know, they blend in nicely and it looks like a natural shadow. So I'm gonna work on that for a while, and then we're gonna layer some colors on top to, well, make it a bit more realistic. I can't say I did a very neat job there, but I tried my best. So we need to leave it to dry and we can work on some other parts. So for that little skirt area and the stem, I'm gonna use wet on wet technique because it also again has those colors, gray colors sort of blending in very seamlessly. It doesn't have very hard watermarks or shapes. So when you want your very smooth transitions from shadow into light, wet on wet is perfect technique for that. So when you paint with grays, it sometimes can be hard to identify where is light and where is shadow. So pick the lightest part of your area in the mushroom on that stem and that skirt. So that will be your white of the paper. And so anything that it's darker, it's probably gonna have to be covered with pigment. So, but you do want to keep it quite light and soft because essentially you are painting what is supposed to look almost white. So once I've done those basic foundation layers, I can move on again to the area we just painted and apply a little bit of color. So because you painted all these little folds and lines, when you apply water glaze, you want to be very extra careful so you don't rub off all those little lines and hard work that you put in. So try to apply water in minimum amount of brush strokes and just quickly. Just a bit of water, it will help to apply that color and for it to look a little bit more soft. And so I apply my cool and warm midtones there. And before the glaze dried, I can lift off a little bit more color from few areas that I wanted to be lighter and apply an extra into the shadows. So normally after I've done my foundation layers, I start then building tonal values. Even if the area is very light and soft, I still want to bring in those layers because that's what gives the realism and dimension to each object, even if you paint white objects. So you really dilute your pigments, and with very, very watery pale pigments, I glaze smaller sections at a time, not a whole area as we did with wet on wet, and soften little glaze edges with clean down brush, and that way I build tonal values. So little glazes at a time, little sections at a time, soften with clean down brush and build a little bit that character and form and shadow. Once we've done that, we can pick up again now our smallest brush and start doing the dry brush technique in order to bring in the last detail, to just again make that surface more like it's been drawn with pencils, just because it's just so much smoother and more realistic looking that way. I just like when I see very velvety smooth surface rather than blotchy, patchy. And some people might prefer it because that's one of the watercolor characteristics, to see the clear watermarks, but it's not to my liking. I like it when it looks quite smooth and velvety, so I always end up dry brushing at the end. No matter how smooth it may look, I still like to do a little bit of dry brushing. It just gives a little bit of that oomph, and all the shadows look a bit more deeper and there's a bit more detail. I focus even at the smaller area now than when I did the glazing. So once we've done all that, you can probably see that underneath that cap there's this bright yellow color. And so when you paint with yellows, what you usually do is paint your shadows with grays first and then layer that yellow on top. And so that is exactly what we did. I don't know if you thought maybe I missed it, but here that yellow right on top of the shadow colors. And here you have it, just a few grass strands and the painting is finished. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next videos. Like and subscribe if you like it. Bye bye.